Hello all you beautiful people, it is Melody back here with your Monday movie review. Today I have a fun one that is a movie that I think is super underrated and really exciting to try to talk about. A little hard to talk about just because if you haven't seen it, it doesn't maybe fully make sense trying to explain it, but the movie that I am going to be reviewing today is The Cabin in the Woods. This one came out in 2011 and it does star a pre-Thor Chris Hemsworth technically. So it came out in 2011. It was filmed prior to that, I believe a year or two before, but it got shelved. MGM I think was going through bankruptcy and it just wasn't a priority to them, and then they ended up a different production company. I don't remember which one at the top of my head right now, but they ended up picking that one up and they thought it would be a hit. I don't know if it necessarily was a hit. I think this is kind of more classified at this point as like a cult kind of movie where it just has a certain kind of fan base that follows it. I personally love the movie. I think it is so different and so unique, and this is just one of those movies that you go into having really no concept of how it's actually going to end up going. So before I get too ahead of myself, I do think some of the popularity that this movie did end up gaining was due to having Chris Hemsworth in the movie. As I had said previously, this was, he was casted in this movie before he was picked as Thor. However, because the movie had gotten shelved, it ended up being released after he had already been Thor. So I think that seeing somebody who had suddenly gained all this popularity and notoriety be in this random ass movie that nobody's like heard or seen, I think that that really made it kind of grow a bit more, and it ended up getting a bit more of that fan base. I do think that really helped in their favor. It was not on purpose from what I'm aware of, but it really, I think, helped in the long run. So that is a fun fact to think about. So back to our plot here. Again, it's a kind of hard to explain. I think the best way to kind of explain it is it's not necessarily a parody, but it's more so along the lines of taking your very typical horror movies, more so like 80s horror movies, I would say, and just putting a new spin onto it. So we always have like our final girls, we have our slashers. It's just kind of things that it's like you typically know what to expect in these kinds of movies. That's where you kind of think this movie is going, especially I feel like if you watch the trailer, you just kind of think maybe it's just another slasher. But it actually ends up being a movie that dissects the very typical, the stereotypical like 80s slasher movies. So it's really confusing at first. I remember watching it and having absolutely no idea where we were going to end up going with this. Essentially, there's like a background of people running this show. So we have like our scientists in the background who are essentially making it so this group of kids has to essentially go through all of the 80s slasher horror movie tropes, and it's up to them. Like they have to do this annually, I believe, and they have to complete the cycle every year in order for the Earth to keep spinning, basically. I know it sounds really confusing. It's like if you haven't seen it, I don't really know if there's a way that I could possibly explain that it would make sense, but it's just one of those movies where you're entertained, you're scared. There's like, I laughed a lot. I was sad at some points. Like it embodies everything. And it's just so different from what a normal, typical horror film would be classified as. And I really think that it deserves a lot more credit for that, just because it's so unique. Like, I understand if you don't like the movie itself for the acting or whatever it may be, but I do think that you have to give credit to the idea of it being completely brand new. It is not something I have ever seen done before. It's kind of acknowledging all of the tropes and it's just putting it into a different perspective, and I think that that is just so fun to be able to see it from a different point of view And again, I just think there's there's so many emotions in this movie. I laugh a lot, but it is still like a scary movie, and there's some really fun stuff. And if you haven't seen it, I really fully recommend seeing this one. It is a really good conversation piece too. Oh, another fun fact about it is Heather Langenkamp, she was the original Nancy from Nightmare on Elm Street. She is a background worker on the monsters that we see in the movies. So she's married to an SFX specialist who does like the makeup. He designs the monsters that we end up seeing, which, by the way, that in itself is worth watching this movie. You see hundreds of different kinds of species. I mean, it kind of like it plays off of other horror movies, so they obviously can't straight up say like, oh, this is from this movie, but you see things where you're like, okay, so this is supposed to be at one point you see like the 3 strangers from the movie The Strangers. It doesn't say it, you just kind of pick up on it. There's just so many different like factors that you're like, oh, I see what they're trying to kind of connect to, which, and to me, that was like the really fun part, was trying to figure out what exactly they were referencing. Some of it was all brand new, but some of it you kind of could relay back to another movie. And so I'm the kind of person, I just like to be able to connect the dots to things like that. That was very fun for me. So I think that the makeup and the special effects that were done for this movie were really, really good. If you ever want to watch behind the scenes, I really recommend that, because it takes you through the entire process of how exactly they determined who they were going to end up putting in the movie. And a lot of it is actually practical effects. It's not even necessarily like made up. They tried their best to do as little CGI as possible, and I think that it really shows in a good way. You know, I think that there is a very fine line with doing too much CGI, especially movies nowadays. Now, again, this was 2011, but I think that they really worked with what they were given, and it really shows. I highly recommend watching the behind the scenes, just because it was such an eye-opener to see how much work actually goes into all of these characters and these monsters, and it's just really exciting, and people work really hard on that stuff, so I think that you definitely have to give credit where credit is due. Anyway, with that being said, I love this movie. I'm giving it a solid 8.5 out of 10. I know a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily agree with me, which again is totally okay. But this is just a really fun watch for me. This is something I like to just throw in the background, just to kind of look up and laugh every once in a while, or whatever it may be. It's very fun, very exciting. So I highly recommend if you haven't seen, and if you have seen, maybe you should just go and watch it again, because why not? But yes, 8.5 out of 10. I love this movie, and if you guys have any feedback on that, I would love to hear what you have to say about it, because I feel like there's so much that you can kind of talk about with this movie. So there's plenty of conversations that we could kind of start just based off this movie alone. So I'm always open for a discussion, especially about movies. I can talk about movies all day long. But yes. All right, guys. I hope you enjoyed my movie review, and I will see you next week. Bye!